There are so many moving pieces, so many players, so many voices, so many different ways of operating. People are coming in with a lot of different beliefs and backgrounds. And I think just leading with patience and love is just another critical component to making sure it's successful.
Welcome to Natural Collisions, brought to you by COAC Detroit. Conversations about the challenges and opportunities in the nonprofit sector, highlighting the voices and nonprofit work in Detroit and Southeast Michigan, and beyond. I'm your host, Shari Sanders, Program Manager at COAC Detroit. In today's Natural Collisions conversation, we will explore the need for cross-sector collaboration in the nonprofit sector. A collaboration between organizations from different sectors working together is essential to co-creating solutions to some of our region's most pressing issues, including affordable housing. Today, we will hear from experts working at the forefront of community development, sharing insights on how organizations can effectively partner across different sectors. Through stories of both successful and challenging collaborations, we'll uncover valuable lessons on building stronger, more resilient communities. Whether you're involved in nonprofit work, policymaking, or simply passionate about Detroit and Southeast Michigan's future, this episode will offer practical takeaways and inspiration for leveraging partnerships to create transformational impact. Our guests this month are Shari Williams.
So Shari Williams with Detroit Future City. I am the Director of Equitable Neighborhood Planning. Detroit Future City is a nonprofit. We are positioned as a think and do tank. And we really focus a lot of our work on growing, thriving, and resilient neighborhoods and disrupting systemic racism and other inequities that are really focused around growing household income and wealth for Black Detroiters and other Detroiters of color.
Heidi Reijm.
My name is Heidi Reijm. I'm a Principal Community Development Specialist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. I do need to give a disclaimer, which is that the views here, any views expressed here are my own or the presenters and do not represent the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago or the Federal Reserve System. So thank you for letting me do that. The Community Development Policy and Engagement Division at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, of which I am a member, has two charges. One is to understand how the economy impacts low and moderate income communities and families, and the other is to use our resources around research and convening and partnership to increase investment in low and moderate income communities. So that's what I do.
And Madhavi Reddy.
Yes, thank you. I'm Madhavi Reddy. I'm the Executive Director of CDAD, Community Development Advocates of Detroit. We're a membership organization for the community development ecosystem. We have around 150 members across the city of Detroit, and our members are place-based nonprofit organizations, resident-led groups, and folks like the people on this call.
Now, let's dive into today's conversation, exploring the power of cross-sector collaboration. This is a crucial topic, especially when tackling significant regional issues like affordable housing. Each of our guests today brings a distinct perspective from their respective sectors, and we're excited to hear how collaboration plays a role in their work. Let's begin by exploring what cross-sector collaboration means to each of our guests. How does it manifest in their organizations? And why is it a crucial approach for addressing the challenges our communities face?
Well, in my introduction, I shared Detroit Future City is really working to address system challenges, right? Systemic racism and other inequities. And so we really want to see a Detroit that is equitable and sustainable for all. And that work cannot happen in a vacuum. So for us, seeing this vision through, it requires a lot of intentionality, and it absolutely has to include collaboration. So it's core to to pretty much all of our work. at Detroit Future City. So we are making intentional efforts to include as many diverse voices in our publication and research efforts. We're ensuring that we have as many diverse voices in seeking to center lived experience in our programming efforts. And so we have like our think side where we have our publications and research. Then we also have our do side where there's programming and convenings. And so through our convening tables and making these efforts to connect with as many diverse stakeholders, our aim is to really foster collective action and impact to advance economic equity in Detroit.
I can go. I was trying to see if you might go first, but I'll go. I think, to build on what Shari's talking about, all the things that people are working on in Detroit are very complex issues. We're also, doing some community development ecosystem building work, trying to do some system transformation. And that really requires an effort for all of us to work together differently. We don't believe that it requires all of us to be, the best of friends, but it really requires us to work together in a way that maybe we're not used to working. So I think we see everything as sort of a dotted line. Everything is connected. Particularly for us, it might feel like we're a little bit niche because, we talk about community development and neighborhood power, but really the things that impact communities really happen at different scales. So it happens at your house, at the block, at the city, state, national, sometimes international levels. And really to touch those particular issues, we really just have to work together. And so I think what we've done at CDAD is try to make sure that we're a nimble and agile organization that's able to work with different people in different ways. So if you look, we have a really robust public policy agenda, but that doesn't mean we don't work in partnership with sometimes the people who are maybe the recipients or the targets of our public policy demands. We just really know that we have to work at things from multiple angles. And I think one quick example is CDAD along with LISC leads Detroit's regional housing partnership. And, something like housing, which is central to almost everything, has to include people from the school board, private developers, nonprofits, sort of everybody if we're going to take a housing first approach. So sometimes it may feel like unusual partners, but it really is just probably the only way we can tackle some of these big issues. Your turn now, Heidi.
I think I loved both of those responses, and I think only what I would add to it, well, from my perspective, and from that at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago is, using our role as sort of a neutral convener. We're a nonpartisan entity. We're working with, we're doing tons of outreach and engagement with community partners. We also are working with financial institutions. We're working with, philanthropy and other sort of entities that have sources of funding. So it's important to, bring those different stakeholders together because each of those pieces has a particular role to play in coming up with and implementing solutions, right? And I think both of you have spoken to this already, but what I always like to say is we need all the solutions and we need all the solutionaries, right? So we need all of it. There's so many different pieces of the ecosystem. People and institutions in the ecosystem play roles in the problems. And so they have to play roles in the solutions too. And so you're not going to understand the problem if you're not talking to everybody who's touching it. And so it's just important to bring all those different voices together. So I think that's how we see it. That's what we try to do.
And I think maybe before we move on, I don't know that we used the word power. I mean, I think it's central to all of these issues and all of our solutions and partnerships is really the central tenet of what we're trying to do is shift power to create change for people in Detroit and in the region. And, power moves, it's very complicated. And Heidi said, we need those folks around the table as well as part of, I love the word solutionaries. So as part of our community of solutionaries, we need everyone around the table, including those, we think have traditional power, non-traditional power, all of those things. We all just need to share space and work together. because power moves in very complex ways. So our interactions with power also maybe need to be complex and strategic, and need all of us to move in certain ways.
Can I just add one thing to that? Because like all good points, and I think leading with curiosity, right? Like collaborations, you have all these different voices, and in a lot of cases, you do have folks that have traditionally held the power. It might have even been a part of what these systemic challenges are. But like, if everyone leading with curiosity and like really being open, I think that also helps for having really strong collaborative efforts.
And I think it's really important to understand sort of people's motivations for being around the table, I think, which probably brings us into a conversation about relationship building. It seems, the issues we're working on are just so urgent, but it can't be so urgent that we don't really know each other is really an important part, especially if you don't move in the same circles, but you really know each other as people, and to understand as people and organizations what are people's motivations, what are the institutional motivations for being around whatever collaborative is happening, certainly helps to understand how to move the work forward.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one other thought that comes to mind around both of those comments, which I think are great. I love, curiosity, right? Because it's like, if you lead with curiosity, you're not trying to have a conversation about whose fault it is or who's to blame, but just like, how are we getting to the ideas to make this happen? How are we refocusing on the impact? How are we focusing on making change rather than pointing fingers, or, which there has to be that too. I think, just not pointing fingers, but there has to be accountability, I think, but there also needs to be a focus on, let's stay curious and figure out how to work together to solve these, not focus on dissecting the problem, researching the problem to death, kind of.
As we continue this insightful discussion, the theme of collaboration stands out, especially when addressing monumental challenges like affordable housing. It's clear that no single organization or sector can solve an issue of this magnitude alone. It requires a collective effort and collaborative action. In the 11 Trends in Philanthropy for 2024 report, the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University highlights affordable housing as a top issue and national crisis in our country. The report revealed that according to NeighborWorks America, nearly 3/4 of Americans, 74%, cited the availability of affordable housing as a major problem in their community. I asked our guests to share real-world initiatives their organizations are doing to address the affordable housing crisis in Detroit and Southeast Michigan. We understand addressing this topic is one that deeply requires cross-sector collective action. Let's join in again to hear their impactful efforts.
Well, I thought of a couple like local things, less to more degree that sort of I'm involved in. I mean, Madhavi, you mentioned the Regional Housing Partnership, and that's a big endeavor, which I'm sure, you'll talk about. The other thing I would say locally, first of all, there's more opportunity for more actions around affordable housing in Detroit. There's a lot happening, but there's a lot more needed. And, but I would say that some bright spots that I thought about when I was thinking about this question were the city of Detroit has a Detroit Housing for the Future Fund, which is a really interesting and continues to be a really great tool for affordable housing development by kind of aggregating sort of private and public dollars, both sort of loan and grant capital dollars, to incentivize affordable housing production and preservation. And so that's I think a tool that I keep hearing about, sort of independent from different folks in the ecosystem, about how useful that tool has been and how useful it could continue to be if it was refunded and expanded. So that's sort of one effort that I think has been really interesting. And I think if Jermaine were here, obviously he would talk about the their work in the Strategic Neighborhood Fund. Although they always say they don't do housing necessarily, a lot of their work impacts housing. And so on a neighborhood level, working with local developers, building the capacity of developers, producing mixed income, mixed use housing in neighborhoods, I think has been a really interesting initiative that has learned a lot of lessons along the way about collaboration and cross-sector collaboration. That is something to lift up.
I'll jump in. At Detroit Future City, we have what we call the Detroit Neighborhood Housing Compact. And through the compact, that is essentially it's a learning community, and we're actually working to really think about how to evolve the compact to move a little more towards action as well. But as a community of local practitioners who all are focused on neighborhoods and housing in various ways, not only are we coming together monthly to learn from local and national thought leaders, we're also really working collectively to really see home ownership increase, housing quality improvements, and cost burden reductions for both renters and homeowners. And so through that work, several collective efforts have taken place that have been really focused. There's been a really strong focus on affordable home ownership models that has really been amazing. I'm actually new in the role. I've been at DFC for officially 9 years as of last month. But this role I'm pretty new in. And so I've been really learning even a little more intimately around, the impacts that some of our compact members have been able to make, both through their work, but also by having access to one another through this compact to really advance these affordable homeownership models.
Thank you. And I think, I mentioned very briefly the Regional Housing Partnership. A Regional Housing Partnership is a local effort to implement some recommendations from MISHTA's statewide housing plan. It's very complex work. There's, hundreds of people who've touched the engagement process and moving an action plan together. That is a very diverse group of people, including, community development organizations, city. Heidi leads one of our working groups. So that is, I think, one really promising thing that's happening sort of at a larger scale in the city. This is happening all across the state. So that is one thing. I think another thing that is really important to call out here is the CDO fund, so the Community Development Organization Fund, which is a pooled fund of, I think there are 7 funders in the fund who are really supporting community development organizations, many of whom are neighborhood-based nonprofit developers. And that is incredibly difficult work to make the numbers work. The community development model across the country, it's largely understood that real estate is a way to sort of earn revenue and help your nonprofit, but it doesn't always happen that way. So these place-based nonprofits are doing incredibly difficult work, and so I think this pooled fund that supports these organizations through general operating support and technical assistance and one-on-one coaching and travel funds and all of these things is really, really important. I really feel like that's been a huge sort of game changer in the affordable housing space. And then, something related to that, and then this is my last example, is something called the Rebuilding Home Together project. Rebuilding Home Together is a cohort of 8 community development organizations, all at various experiences of developing affordable housing. So together they've rehabbed, not together, but across the 8 of them, they have rehabbed 15 properties across the city that they've acquired from the land bank. We've been able to pool some funds for that, provide some one-on-one technical assistance through a group of consultants we're working with to help really with the nuts and bolts. There's a shared construction management feature. So this is a pilot program that we're really trying to finish the pilot, do some, figure out some lessons learned and learn how we can expand the pilot to help the other sort of nonprofit developers do single family housing that's for sale for people and families at 60% AMI or under. So the numbers are a little bit tricky, but I think, it's been really rewarding to watch the 8 work very hard and figure out how to make it work. So I think that's something that has real potential to scale.
I have one more example, and I can't believe I forgot this, is a sort of burgeoning movement in Detroit around community land trusts. And there are several neighborhoods in the city that are considering establishing community land trusts in their neighborhood to ensure permanent affordable housing for homeownership, rental, and commercial as well. So that's there's been a community ownership learning table that's been established and met several times over the past couple of years for stakeholders and backbone organizations to create sort of structures to support community land trusts throughout the city. And we've been learning from other places that have been doing this and doing research on, how that model could work in Detroit, and the different ways to work with the city and the land bank. But it's a really important model because access to homeownership is one thing, but as we know, property values tend to increase, and housing values increase, and then those sort of on-ramps to affordable homeownership become fewer and fewer for a lot of people. So that's a really interesting and innovative model. And I've been working with Adina Hill and the Kresge Foundation to kind of co-facilitate these roundtables for the last year and a half or so. And they've been really rewarding, and a lot of people are getting great information from them. And we hope that'll lead to more community land trusts in the city.
I think maybe, what we have not talked about yet, I think we've all touched on it, but we are at a real, I think, critical juncture probably in the world. And I don't feel that's an exaggeration around the issues of affordable housing. I mean, it's always been something unattainable for many people, but I think right now the housing market is wildly out of control. This is impacting everybody. And I think, I've been in Detroit and in my role at CDAD for almost 12 years. And it feels like, when I got here 12 years ago, there was sort of the feeling amongst many people, oh, well, we won't ever experience that kind of issue in Detroit because of our, all of our foreclosure issues and vacancies and all of those things. But here we are, like many other huge cities, experiencing the same issue. And I think without interventions, like Heidi's talking about land trusts and land banks and working together to try to figure out some solutions, bar saying we're going to develop a whole bunch of, income-based housing, that really the work that we're all doing is really trying to catch up to something that has gotten out ahead of us. And I think, our various connections to national movements are also really important to think about, the housing first approach to neighborhood development, thinking about housing as an absolute human right. Without housing, housing impacts, school outcomes, ability to, work, transportation, all of those things is sort of the central core to almost anything. So anything we're trying to do, to advance, any sort of outcome, economic, social, all the kinds of outcomes, really central to any of those strategies has to be housing. And so I'm just grateful for the opportunity to talk about affordable housing specifically, because I think that's where we are facing an issue, I think, that is a larger scale than many other cities. Other cities are facing this issue, but combined with rising housing prices, being a city that's new to having so many renters, and sort of the issues with income and people really dealing with and grappling with poverty makes the scale in Detroit, I think, a little bit unique, but something we all certainly have to work to figure out. So I am really encouraged by the conversation around land trusts and sort of alternative models to housing, because I think we almost have no choice at this point is to think about all the different types of affordability models.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned income, because at the core of it, yes, affordable housing is right there at the core, and housing is definitely attached to so many indicators that lead to outcomes, but also at the core of that is income. And when we look at Detroit, like the disparity, the racial and spatial disparities in income is huge. And so like it's almost like you have to like join. And this is something I've been kind of like grappling with in my mind. As I mentioned, I'm in this new role and I'm really trying to think about, thriving and resilient neighborhoods and how neighborhoods and housing, like how the work that we're doing within our little tiny department within the organization can like help, foster, this collaborative spirit that's taking place in our ecosystem, but also move this work forward. And income just keeps coming up for me, right? Like the disparities are so huge and Detroiters are just not, the household income is just so much less than what we even see in comparison to the region. So just lifting that up is a really great opportunity. And I am super excited about Heidi. You're actually on my to-do list to like call or email specifically about this work because I'm really inspired by it as well.
Yeah, let's do it. I think that, it's really important to talk about because this is this is like where cross-sector collaboration is really needed, right? Because it's not just getting people in a house, it's about also quality housing too, because we know that historically there's been a lot of affordable housing in Detroit, and I put there on quotes if I don't know, people can hear that, but it's been really low quality housing. The quality of housing in Detroit historically has been shameful. There's like no other way to describe it. People living with holes in their roof and no heat, and it's just should not be happening in a country with as many resources as we have. And so there's the quality piece, and it goes back to the income, and there's so many. It's like the housing issue. You talk about one problem, and then you sort of undo that layer of the onion, and then there's some other problem, and it's so complex. Monica, you said this too, right? It's so complex. There's so many different pieces of it. There's the quality, and then that goes into home repair, and that goes into construction workforce, and that goes into investment, that goes all these, right? It just becomes, and sometimes you think about all those pieces and it becomes overwhelming, but that's the importance of cross-sector collaboration, because there's people working on these different pieces of the layers of the onion who can bring solutions to those pieces of it. And so it just brings me back to like the importance of cross-sector collaboration for all of that.
As we delve deeper into the layers of collaboration, it's essential to focus on how we can ensure these efforts are both effective and equitable. This brings up important questions about maintaining an equitable lens in all aspects of this work, especially when considering the long-term sustainability and impact on our neighborhoods. I asked our guests how they approach this balance. How do they ensure that equity remains at the forefront of their collaborative efforts? And what strategies are they using to sustain these initiatives for lasting impact? Let's hear their insights on embedding equity into the core of their work.
I'll just jump in with the first thing that comes to mind. And this response is really inspired by work that I did with Heidi, actually, in her prior role. And it's evolutionary in my mind, but through the work that she and I led, there was a restorative framework for philanthropy that was developed. And since that report has come out, I've really been thinking about what our collective role is in ensuring that the work that takes place collectively in our communities for Detroiters, what it needs to look like. And this phrase of equitable engagement and reparative outcomes is what really stands out to me. And so I'm just going to start us off by saying, I think it starts with having like really intentional efforts to like shift power, to be inclusive, and really thinking about what those outcomes should be. reparative outcomes, the way we describe it is, or are outcomes that are closing inequity gaps, and offsetting past inequities. And so the way I kind of frame it in my mind is making a deliberate effort to ensure that those that have been marginalized and where we see the most inequities, that they are now going to outperform the status quo as a result of the efforts that we made, right? So kind of like leading with that thought process and some of those principles in the work that we do.
Just to build off of that, because that was that work continues to inspire me, to this day too. So I think that that work led to a lot of lessons that I hope continue to sort of guide ways that, philanthropy and other sources of funds, government, corporate, philanthropic, whatever, financial institutions, how they consider, making investments in communities. And a piece that I think is really important is that, you have to acknowledge the inequities to begin with, right? I mean, you can't talk about equity and have equitable outcomes if you don't acknowledge the inequity that's occurred historically. And so just that being, and acknowledge it, take accountability for it, and then focus on future outcomes. So there's, I think that's a really big piece of it. And then I think we've talked about this already, but just to sort of, continue to sort of emphasize it is that, that it's necessary to get voices of people who are most impacted. Right. And so, that's why organizations like CDAD, and Detroit Future City are so important, is because they're doing that work. They're doing the focus groups. So they're doing the engagement. They're doing the on the ground work directly with organizations, nonprofits, families, individuals who are experiencing housing challenges, economic challenges, and then that has to be a piece of the research, the data collection, and the solutions.
I think just to agree with everything that has been said, and I think I'd also just like to add, I think the importance of really operationalizing some of our principles around equity. We use a lot of words, we say a lot of things, we spend a lot of time with the, what we all like to call the coalition of the willing, like people who generally understand and feel these things. And the work of really working with people who are most impacted by all the things we're talking about is drastically sort of underfunded. So I think back to that study of, funding and equity, there are a few organizations that have sort of unpacked similar things and trying to maybe work with our partners in philanthropy to talk about, with them about how power moves. Those are folks that we talk about who has traditional power. So how do we sort of talk to them and really have a shared conversation about how power moves, and money is power. I mean, sometimes money is the solution to a lot of things. We can just fund something and get out of the way. And other times it's not. But I think, Sharnae, in relation to your question, one part of your question about the sustainability of the collaborative work is that is something that needs to be funded. I think what often happens is up to some nonprofit to figure out a way to sort of lead this work. I've spent my entire career in very complicated sort of cross-sector collaborative work. And I think the key when it falls apart is that it's not a long-term, chronically funded part of the work that is somebody's job. It has to be someone's job to bring people together, to do all the administrative things, all the relationship building, knowing why everyone is around the table. And that is a really hard thing to do when it's not, a well-funded and predictably funded part of the work. And I think in a city like Detroit, it's even hard to say that out loud, because are we sometimes, deeply reflecting, are we taking money out of, real first response things that are really funding, the needs of residents. There's a lot of competing priorities for money. But if we really believe that this cross-sector collaborative work is the pathway forward to some of these really complicated issues, it needs to be funded. And I think, people need to be trained in how to work this way and how to operate in that space. It's not usual, not just, I'm stopping myself. I was about to say in the nonprofit world, we compete a lot, but there's just general, like a culture of competition, and maybe it's against sort of our nature in some cases to really work together in a certain way. So there just also has to be the grace and space of time, and which is also in competition with the issues are moving forward, and maybe we don't have that much time. So it is really, I think, a hard place to operate, but it's really a powerful place to operate in. But it just requires a lot of work. And I am someone who really believes in two things. One is that I think there's always a pathway to yes. We can just figure it out. And maybe yes is not what I thought it was yesterday, but there's always a way forward. And two, that the process is as important as the outcome. Detroit is not a huge city, not small, but not, 5 million people where you can get lost in. The process and our relationships are extremely important moving forward. We'll always run into each other. We'll always be operating in the same space. And all of that really just requires some intentional resources, some capacity building. I think we talk a lot about capacity building for smaller nonprofits or just nonprofits in general. But I think in the idea of like transforming systems, ecosystem building, collaboration, we all also can, I think it's safe to say maybe we all need to learn how to do that better, because it really is an art and a skill. And I think many of us sort of fall into that work and sort of make it work as we go along. But it's hard and it needs some attention, some resources, and all of that stuff.
All that stuff.
All that stuff. I was going to make the list longer, but I was like, I think that covers it.
I mean, I'm so glad. I always think about this. The work that I'm sort of trying to do at the Fed now around, bringing different types of investors and funders together. And, I can talk about this a little bit, but I did, I held this community development investment roundtable, which really builds off the work that CDAD had been doing around sort of equitable funding, and in partnership, with CDAD, sort of running these community development investment roundtables. And the point in some ways is to knowing that there's that tendency for us to compete, like how do we get even funders and investors want to compete, either they're banks because they're competing for business, or they're funders or other, philanthropic funders or other folks, they're competing because, I don't know, I can't really speak for why they're competing, but there's a sense of like wanting, sometimes I wonder, I'll speak in the language of curiosity, Shari, like I wonder, like, is it a wanting to get credit for something? Is it, or like, what's the competing coming from? Like why? And I just, maybe, I don't have sort of as much of the sort of competitive, spirit around this. Cause for me, it's like, what do we just need to do to make impact? Like what's going to be the thing to make us impact? Not what do we need to do so that someone's getting credit for something? And I think that, and again, these are totally just my views, but, I see that happen. And when I was in philanthropy, I certainly saw that happen. It was, very much, we, of wanting to sort of, be sort of known as the main supporter or whatever. And instead of worrying about, or instead of like focusing on sort of what's the impact and what's going to be the solution. And so like that, in those kinds of collaborative conversations, we have to sort of leave our ego out of it and leave our organizational ego out of it. And just, and how I saw that manifest a lot of times was that like a reluctance to share information about what's going on and what they're doing. Because then someone might sort of steal it or copy it or whatever. And it's like, no, like let's just share information so that we can then work together, so that we can leverage our funds for something for bigger impact. And I sort of saw that happen so much when I was in philanthropy. And so the idea you're right. We have to sort of get out of that. Maybe it's some training, or maybe it's some other types of, exposure to just how do we work together? How do we, be willing to share information so that we can do things differently. Things have been done a certain way for a very long time. Those things have probably helped contribute to some of the problems that we're now facing. So we got to do things differently, and we have to be willing to do things differently. And that will require us to be more willing to share, be more willing to work together, if we really care about the things that we say we care about.
As we start to wind down, I invite all of you listening to reflect on this journey of cross-sector collaborations at your own organizations. What are some of the ways your organization can take part in more cross-sector, equity-centered collaborations? I asked our guests to share once more, this time about some of the lessons they have learned along the journey of collaborating. What insights have they gained from collaborative experiences? How can these reflections guide us as we look to address future challenges together? Let's hear our guests' final thoughts on the power and potential of collaboration.
I think one challenge, which I understand greatly, is the idea that we just can't do this in Detroit. That, there's so many players, there's so many overlapping interests. And what I've heard repeatedly is that we just, we can't. We're not built as a city to do this. And I absolutely reject that notion. We can, and people are doing it. I mean, people are doing it all the time. So I think that's been a challenge, is the amount of time it sort of spends to convince people, let's try this again. Maybe you've been harmed in the past by a similar effort, but really let's try to do it a little bit differently. And I think one lesson just generally from this type of collaborative work is how hard it is to build relationships when you're halfway through the work. I think because we're all like very busy people, we work very hard, the issues we're tackling are difficult, that there's a tendency to just jump into the work and not know why we're here or who's around the table. And it's really difficult to go backwards, because without putting that sort of upfront work, there's a lot of space for things to go not in the area of curiosity or turning to wonder. There's just a lot of room. And when you don't know, and there's not a lot of space, I think there's a lot of room to make up stories. So I think that there's a real balance of how to sort of do this work. And I think it's always wonderful to have some examples of how this has worked well in your back pocket to share, like, this is like the power of coming together. These are the things that can happen. So that's what I think I've learned, Sharnae, in the past couple of years.
I love what you said. The way it resonates is believing the impossible is possible. And I just think that's an important phrase to go into this work with, or to continue to lead in this work with, is like really believing that the impossible is possible, because it is. But I also would like to add, cross-sector collaboration takes patience, flexibility, and I try to lead in love with everything I do. Just smile and just lead with love. Because, there are so many moving pieces, so many players, so many voices, so many different ways of operating. People are coming in with a lot of different beliefs and backgrounds. And I think just leading with patience and love is just another critical component to like making sure it's successful.
I'm trying to think of what lessons I would add to those. I think those are ones that I was thinking about too. So, but I think that the other lesson I might talk about is just sort of making sure, having opportunities for folks to get something from the collaboration, whether it's information that helps inform their work, whether it's resources that can, technical or sort of, more concrete sort of financial resources, like just, having opportunities. And I think that all the collaborations I know that we're all involved in do that. They sort of offer information and that people can take back and inform their work. So just making sure that it's beneficial to everyone involved would be what I would add.
Yeah, and clarity. That you just made me think about that too. Like being clear. I remember there was years ago, a professional colleague of mine made a comment. It was a collaborative effort, and I think community engagement was attached to it. And the comment was, well, everyone should know that thing, right? Without giving a whole lot of detail. And, my response then and still is we can't make assumptions, right? Like you can never make an assumption on what people think or how people are coming to the table with us. Is like, even when convening folks for a particular topic, like leading with clarity, I think is like so important, because sometimes we have so many things on our plate and we are coming to the table knowing we're going to talk about this thing, but we may not be clear on some of the other pieces. And so if you're leading that convening effort, just also making sure that everything is clear. Who's leading, having clear roles, having clear visions, and making that a collaborative effort, but like leading with clarity as well.
I think, Madhavi, what you said before about like having Shari, you talked about patience, and Madhavi talked about how just time it takes. It's like, it is going to take time. And so, there's a lot of, I think, sometimes collaborative efforts where people want to see actions really soon. And that's going to, I've just seen that before where it's hard to get there without that building of trust and real kind of relational experiences with each other. So just that, I'm reminded, just thinking about how long personally I've been involved in like different types of work, and like what I used to be aware of and like 25 years ago, like can't even believe I'm saying that. And then to, like thinking about community land trusts even back then and being like, wow, I can't even, that's like such an alternative thing, and then now to be like talking about it in a real kind of more mainstream way, just to know that it took a lot long to kind of get there is like, yes, like it's going to take a long time, and we just have to keep trucking at it, Yeah.
And I think another thing related to this relationship building, I think it helps to say up front, like, this is actually part of the work. So some of the things we're going to like track or measure for people who sort of need that kind of thing is that we, that's actually the work. And so it's not sort of wasting time. It is actually action, and to sort of be clear about why we want to do that. And back to Heidi, like, what do people need to get out of it? How are we going to know that unless we do a little like one-on-one, conversations, relationship building? That I think saying that is built into the work from day one, and being clear about why it's important, and to name those things as outcomes when people, say, well, we haven't really done anything but talk, but we have sort of set some ground rules. We know each other better. We know what everyone is doing. We know why you're around the table. So to just include that's like a very practical thing, but I think sometimes we forget that is the work. And so we should talk about it that way. And so maybe that framing helps people from feeling like we haven't done anything and it's been 3 months.
Thank you to all of our guests. Shari Williams, Director of Equitable Neighborhood Planning at Detroit Future City. Learn more at DetroitFutureCity.com. Heidi Reijm, Principal Community Development Specialist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. More information at chicagofed.org. And Madhavi Reddy, Executive Director at Community Development Advocates of Detroit, also known as CDAD. Check out their work at cdad-online.org. This has been the Natural Collisions podcast from COACT Detroit. Remember, the word COACT itself means to work together, because we know we cannot have transformational impact if we only work alone. To learn more about our work, visit coactdetroit.org. Please subscribe to Natural Collisions on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We will be back with more conversations soon. Thank you for listening.